2004-2005 Will, Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies Speaker Series. My name is Kimberly McGoldrick, and I'm a professor in the Economics Department of the Business School. This is a special year for the co-sponsors of this series, the co-sponsors being the Women Involved in Living and Learning and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. The 2004-2005 academic year marks the 25th anniversary of these two programs. That's a quarter century of commitment to the intellectual and leadership development of young women at this institution and as the community at large. The theme for this series, this anniversary year, is interrogating limits, pushing boundaries, artists, academics, and activists. And all of the speakers, the 7 of them, the 7 events that are sponsored, push those boundaries across the artists, academics, and activists. This afternoon's speaker is Nathan Long, whose talk is entitled The Space Between Boy and Girl, Facts and Fiction. Nathan Long will be introduced in just a moment by 2 students, and I will in turn introduce them. But first, the Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies Speaker Series, /Will Speaker Series, has always tackled difficult issues. These issues are ones that have no simple problems and that really require conversations across students and across the university and different communities. We encourage you to continue the conversations beyond what is stimulated here through our interactions with Nathan Long beyond these walls in this environment to those other peers that you may have conversations with as well. Making this afternoon's event possible, we need to thank a number of groups that have been very active in supporting this event. First of all, the Richmond Quest, the university's Cultural Affairs Committee, the Gottwald Speakers Board, the University Chaplaincy, the Booker Chair in Religion and Ethics, Department of English, Office of Student Development, and West Hampton College. Now, we would be remiss if we did not also thank those individuals who were active in developing the entire speaker series, headed by Holly Blake, the director of the Will program, and Liz Sheehan, who's in the back of the room, the assistant director of the Will program. Other important members of this group include Elizabeth Bruner, who's a member of English in the WGSS faculty and a former coordinator of this program, and Ms. Karen O'Connell, the administrative assistant of the Will program. Following Nathan's talk, there will be a period of time, a half hour, that is allowed for questions. So please hold your questions till the end of his talk, and we can have the conversation at that point. And with that, I'm happy to introduce 2 students who will in turn introduce Nathan Long. Vicki Brim is a sophomore student of Will and serves as the community outreach coordinator, is a major in English, and is looking forward to the opportunity of studying Shakespeare in London this fall. Charmaine Wiggins is a junior in the business school, marketing concentration. She's been vice president of New Directions for the past 2 years. And for those of you who may not be familiar with New Directions, it's a collaboration of students among all sexualities, promoting awareness through visibility, understanding through education, and appreciation through the acceptance of sexual minorities. So, Charmaine and Vicki, please.
Feel free to add whatever you like.
Oh, yeah. So let's begin. Nathan Long received his Bachelor's of Arts in English from the University of Maryland in good old 1986 with high honors. He continued his education at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, earning himself a Master's of Arts in 1989. His pursuit of education did not end there. In 1999, Nathan Long received his Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Virginia Commonwealth University here in good old Richmond. As an author, he has been published in numerous publications, from journal articles, also anthologies. His works have been anthologized in books for the past decade, almost going on a decade and a half. His first works were published in RFD Journal around 1991, and where he wrote an article, a regular creative non-fiction article in RFD Journal. He's also had many works published in The Sun as well as the Indiana Review. Some of his works include Desire, Gratitude, and Mercy, as well as That, which I read and I love. Not only does he write short stories and poetry, he also has many plays and monologues that have been produced at UCU as well as the Downtown Museum.
Now, aside from his impressive academic credits and his innumerable publications, Nathan Long's resume also boasts countless awards and honors. And to name them all would probably eat up most of the lecture time, and we don't want to do that. So just to give you an idea, since 1998, he's been nominated, a finalist, and the winner of over 10 different awards and prestigious distinctions, some of which include the Glimmer Train Short Story Contest, the Triton College Poetry Contest, and the award for Best Gay Fiction. Nathan's long talent does not lie only in his writing abilities, but in his public speaking and performance skills as well. He has been featured at numerous conventions, speaking on topics of sex, gender, sexuality, and the representation of the queer culture. And that's pretty much why he's here to talk to us today.
He also stays grounded in his community service, in his community through his volunteer work. He has fought continuously to establish a queer cultural community and working with GLPT. He's been a facilitator of discussions, a leader for rights, and a coordinator of change.
And now, without taking away any more of his time from the true purpose of today's presentation, it is our pleasure to welcome writer, performer, volunteer, and mentor, Nathan Long.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Vicky, for showing. I'm not sure we'll sort of test my public speaking and presentation skills now, I guess.
You get close to the mic.
Oh, sure. Maybe I can raise this. Okay, I'll just I'll just add goat farmer to that. And I want to thank Kimberly for already taking care of thanking so many people, and particularly Liz Sheen for coordinating this and making it so easy. I apologize if I scared her for showing up at the last moment. All right.
Back the lights off.
But I'll let you decide. Good? Okay. How about if I just try to speak loudly? Is that good for everybody? Okay. Let me know if I start to slip and speak too quietly. All right. I just want to start off with a brief overview. I'm going to give an introduction to sort of bring us up to date on contemporary sort of theories on gender and sex, and then give us a definition of intersex, a brief history of intersex and hermaphrodites in Western culture, a few considerations to sort of close the PowerPoint presentation, and then a brief reading from my novel, Different Finland, which is about an intersex person growing up in Central Ohio. To begin the introduction, I guess I sort of just want to go back to the title and suggest that I don't mean to imply that you're going to get the facts necessarily in the PowerPoint presentation and then the fictions, that hopefully, as any writer wishes, that there's some sort of fictional truth or emotional truth to a piece of fiction, and that, of course, facts are just sort of slippery, or as David Byrne says, facts just twist the truth around. And as well, in introduction, I want to just point to a long history of work in gender and sexuality studies that has sort of led to this place. Let me know if my head hides something really important. Maybe I should just come over here. You can stop looking at me. Particularly, I want to acknowledge the book Sexing the Body by Anne Costa Sterling. It came out in 2000. She's done a lot of work on intersex and thinking about gender. She's a biologist as well as a feminist and sort of a theorist. And I'll just sort of start off by pointing out her what I would consider her main thesis, which is labeling someone a man or a woman is a social decision. Okay? And in order to sort of understand that, I'm going to sort of hopefully lead you all through that using a number of different sources. Anybody who's sort of gone through 1970s feminism will sort of understand that there's the idea that we have sex, which is a real physical thing, and then on top of that is sort of mapped gender. So that we have a male body or a female body, but whether that body is supposed to sew or make a living or be physical or be passive, those are things that are sort of gendered onto the sex. But more contemporary sort of theory has suggested that, particularly drawing from Foucault's notion of the genealogy of knowledge, that knowledge is sort of stacked on top of other knowledge and makes the lower knowledge seem more real. We can consider that it goes further than that, that we start off as objects, and then we're given or assigned bodies. Those bodies are assigned sex, and then those sexes are gendered. I'm going to spend a little time now just sort of trying to explain that, because as it is, it might seem confusing. We can think about, first of all, T.S. Eliot says, we are people, but we are also things. So in a sort of very existential way, we are all objects. But another way to think about that is if you think about the moment, you think about an egg cell being fertilized. Okay? Well, is that an object or is that a human being? Is that a living human or not? And we could argue that that decision is sort of the whole abortion debate. You know, when does a fertilized egg become a human being, a living life form? If it's miscarriaged, if it's aborted, if it's stillborn, is it human or not? So at some point we have to make that decision. We can take a much larger group of cells in the human body, say a tumor, and they're living and they're part of our body, but we wouldn't call them a living thing, right? We would call them an object, a thing, but living but not human. Okay? So at some point we have to make this decision about a number of things when an object is sort of given the quality of a human body. Okay? And then at the other end of the spectrum, as I mentioned, at the top is the question of what elements of ourselves are gendered versus what are sort of biologically real. Okay? And what I'm hoping to center on today is the space between here. When does a body get sort of considered one sex or another? So we sort of see this as the abortion debate, the feminist debate, and then we're going to look at that sort of as a simplified version. This happens the way an object becomes considered a body, and then the body is sex, and the sex is gendered, happens so quickly. And to give you a clearer example of that, let's look at a typical phrase that might be heard at the time of someone giving birth. It's a healthy baby girl, a pretty little girl. Okay? Just imagine someone saying this in the delivery room. What I want to sort of do is sort of go back and look at how this sentence represents all four of those layers of knowledge. If we look at the beginning, the it starts off as an object in this sentence. The thing comes out of the woman, and it is an it. And instantly, it is sort of labeled a human being, a healthy baby. And then that baby, that human, is assigned a sex, and then that sex is gendered. Okay? We'd be less likely to say it's a pretty little boy. We might say, oh, it's a big, strong boy, or something like that. Okay? And we can even, just as an aside, we could go a step further and say, she's going to grow up and make someone a great husband, right? In which case, we've already sort of mapped out her sexual orientation, right? All in the flash of a couple seconds out in the breathing world. Okay. But the question I want to sort of center on is how do we determine a person's sex? What you might do is take a moment to sort of look at these and determine if you think one or another of the pictures here, particularly the ones in the center, are male or female. What are some ways that you're trying to decide that? That's an actual rule. Yeah.
They have a beard.
Okay, so facial hair.
Facial hair.
How else? Yeah.
Facial bone structure.
Okay, the bone structure. Yeah.
Cosmetics.
Cosmetics, whether there's cosmetics. Other things? Yeah.
The hair.
Okay, the hairstyling of the hair. Mhm.
The posture.
Okay, posture. What about if we look at a whole body, just looking around you, as you sweep the audience, you're probably making instant decisions whether people are men or women. How are you making those decisions?
Based on what they're wearing.
Okay, their clothes. Anything else? Yeah,
The way they're sitting.
the way they're sitting,
Smile. Just smile.
how they smile. Okay.
Men and women smile differently.
Okay, the size of their lips too. So we have a series of things that we're making decisions, not based, of course, on actual, biological fundamentals like gender. So we determine sex mostly by external visual characteristics on a day-to-day basis. Here we see, of course, a little baby boy. It was common in the turn of the century to dress babies the same. And this idea of external characteristics, particularly ones that have nothing to do with the actual body, are perhaps clearer exemplified by one of our most popular signs, the male and female sort of bathroom signs. Let's just take a look at this a bit. What is the most distinguishing difference between these two people? The one on the right has what we call a dress, right? Now, if we were aliens, though, we might look at this differently. For instance, okay, the one on your right doesn't seem to have any clothes on, and there doesn't seem to be any penis between their legs, so that's probably the female, right? But the one on the left is sort of covering something up, so that's probably the male, right? Or we could see it as two men, one wearing a dress and one not. Now, there are a couple of other subtle differences. They're the same height, but what are some differences? Yeah.
What we see as the male has the broader shoulders.
Okay, the one on the right has broader shoulders. Uh-huh.
The woman has thinner legs.
Okay, the person on the left has thinner legs. Okay. But not a lot of difference, right? And the most prominent difference is something that's totally culturally specific, right? If we were in Scotland, it's not so what I want to do now is turn from our sort of public way of looking at sex, or determining sex, to looking at how scientists would look at it. But first, Manifesto Sterling says, the more we look for a simple physical basis for sex, the more it becomes clear that sex is not a pure physical category. What we define as male and female come already entangled with our own ideas about gender. Now, we would think that this wouldn't apply to the medical profession, but we'll see sort of how complicated this is. There's usually three criteria that medical professionals would determine, particularly in infant sex. The first is gonads, which are testes or ovaries. The second are chromosomes. And the third is genitalia. So we're going to look at each of those and sort of see how complicated it can get at times when it's complicated. So how many sexes do you think there are based on gonads? Seems like pretty obvious, right? There would be 4. We have the testes, ovaries, those with both a testis and an ovary, and then something that's called a testis ovum, which is sort of a combination of material. And what about with chromosomes? Yeah, that's right. It gets more complicated. At least 8. We have XX, Y, XO, and when we write O, we mean that there's an absent chromosome there, so that person has one less chromosome. XX, XXY, and we'll be talking about some of these more in a bit. XYY, XXXY, and XXY. The last two mosaic, what that means is that depending on where, as I understand, where you, and I'm not a biologist at all, but where you test the body on a given cell, you might get a different reading of the genetic material. And last but not least is how many sexes are determined by genitalia. And this gets even more tricky. And throw up this slide right now because what I'm going to show you next is a little graphic. In fact, it's literally a little graph. And this is actually used in, by doctors to sort of determine, or has been traditionally, to determine what is acceptable as female and male, and what is sort of unacceptable in between. These are in centimeters at birth, so don't freak out. Okay. Provided by Susan Kessler. I guess she doesn't really consider it. We're going to now sort of look at, so all the places that are sort of suggested, that are sort of ambiguous here, are what is known as intersex. And that could be defined as the condition of having chromosomal, genital, or gonadal characteristics that are neither all female or all male. And we're just going to run through talk a little bit about intersexuality. First, it's important to make a distinction that sort of contemporary political use and medical use is intersex, and that sort of covers a whole range of characteristics. And that includes, for instance, somebody with XXY or XYY may not have any external manifestations. So unless they got tested chromosomally, they may not even know that they have this. But they would technically, by some people's standards, be considered intersex. Hermaphrodite is a more traditional term that we use for people whose bodies specifically look sexually ambiguous, and it has a whole sort of historical background, which we're going to go into in a bit. However, I did want to point out two things. That there's two terms that are still often used, and one is the pseudo-hermaphrodite. And this is a person with either ovaries or testes, usually either XX or XY chromosomes, but they have ambiguous sex characteristics. So if you're looking at their body, you might think of them as a hermaphrodite, but in other categories, they're sort of more clearly male or female. Okay? So they're defined as either male pseudo-hermaphrodites or female pseudo-hermaphrodites. And we'll sort of be looking at one example of that. The other term that's used, and not used, but used by the medical community, not necessarily by the intersex community, is a true hermaphrodite. This is a person with either both an ovary and testis, or XX and XY chromosomes. Just a few statistics on intersex. Estimates of the total number of people who might be classified. Thanks to the music. Varies from 0.5% to 2% of the population. And you can imagine it depends on how people choose to categorize these. So if somebody has XX or XYY chromosomes, they have no sort of acknowledgement of that. We can test and statistically figure out how many people those are in the population, but does it really mean anything in a significant way? And of course, a lot of people don't necessarily come out and not all the statistics are reported as well. Chromosomal differences occur in about 3 of every 1,000 children. This is just chromosomal differences. So that's not all of intersex. About twice as common as Down syndrome. Male pseudohermaphrodites and female pseudohermaphrodites each count for about 1/3 of intersex cases. And I just want to sort of turn for a second while we're talking about intersex and specifically talk about the perspective from intersex activists and advocates. And so what I'm going to run here is a series of quotes from contemporary intersex activists that sort of take a particular argument primarily against unnecessary surgical procedures, particularly at birth. And rather than sort of speak for them, I'm just going to use a series of quotes so you can sort of see the logic of the contemporary argument. And this is something that's getting more and more press. First, although physicians understand that they will actually impose rather than determine the sex, they tell parents the test will reveal the child's true sex. And here's a good example. If you look at the Johns Hopkins website for symptoms of abnormal sexual differentiation, Just look at this quote. Individuals born with 45XO46XY. That means some cells have 45 chromosomes, and they're missing, quote unquote, the second sex chromosome, and other cells don't. Mosaicism can appear male, female, or ambiguous at birth. And look what happens. Males, not people who appear male, but suddenly males, experience normal male sex differentiation, and females are essentially identical to girls born with Turner syndrome. Okay? And the ambiguous people have disappeared. There's nothing that comes after this quote that talks about the ambiguous. So within a sentence, the people who appear male and female have suddenly become male and female, and the ambiguous people have disappeared. Suzanne Kessler says, even the term ambiguous genitals is used freely with no apparent need to define what ambiguous means. So even though there's that medical chart that we looked at earlier, if you look at a lot of the medical discussions about this, they'll say, well, if a clitoris looks clearly too enlarged or something like that, or not standard. Although variant genitals rarely pose to the child's life, the condition is referred to as an emergency, seemingly to require life-saving intervention. So I should make a distinction that there are of course times when a child is born and needs to have medical treatment. There are times where either Kessler argues for three reasons. One, that it's, for instance, their urethra won't allow for urine to come outside of their body. So in which case they would die. The second would be to greatly improve their comfort. So if, say they pee, but they sort of cause a huge spray or something, or it's in an incredibly inconvenient place. But the third is to sort of manifest, and this is what the majority of the surgeries are, is to sort of regulate a sort of more normative, standardized sexual appearance. And that's what she argues should not be a cause for surgery. Boileron argues surgery destroys genital autonomy, and many intersex children are subject to repeated surgeries, over a dozen in some cases. Genital surgery disrupts the infant's erotic development, interferes with adult sexual function. I'll warn you, this is the big, heavy text section. Let me get back to it. You can sleep for a little while. Foster Sterling supposedly claims that successful heterosexuality is the main criteria by which gender assignments are made and genital surgery is evaluated. So what that means is, of course, is that when they're deciding, well, should this person be a male or female, later on in life they say, oh yeah, it was successful because that person we assigned as a girl and now she's going out with a guy. Which doesn't necessarily sort of just eradicates the idea that that the person could be gay or lesbian or something else. Surgeons and endocrinologists have, and this is actually this last week, considered leaving a child's body intact and providing emotional support for being different to be an option. Now, of course, some have, and I don't mean to. I think, one of the things that Kessler points out is that most surgeons are really looking to try to improve the lives of people. And the idea is that they believe that sort of a more normative-looking body is going to be an advantage for them. But I'll just sort of say that she also argues that, she says a lot of times the argument to sort of surgically reshape someone's body is that, well, they're going to get teased and they're going to be embarrassed a lot. And then she goes on and says, well, if teasing is really, if this is taken seriously, then what we have is the idea that a group of children are a vocal and acceptable authority for determining how somebody's body should be altered. And that shouldn't physicians or the culture at large start to question how can we correct the culture rather than correct the body so that the culture doesn't. Okay. So So we're going to look, so shift gears, get some more pictures in here, and look at a brief history of intersex in the Western culture, really as hermaphrodites. And a good place to start, actually, is with the Bible. Now I'm going to really get myself in trouble. I'm no biblical scholar either, but what I've heard is that the initial references to Adam are not engendered. So that some people argue that Adam, as God originally created it, as seen in the Bible, is actually a hermaphrodite. And that person, that Adam, then draws femaleness out of Adam, and then they become two separate people, and the person on the right sort of says, okay, you can have the name, I'll take a different name. So that's one sort of interesting difference to take on the one origin myth. Another, when we look at Hermaphroditus himself, which is the person or the mythical god from whom the word hermaphrodite comes from, we see two different stories as well. One is that Hermes and Aphrodite gave birth to a boy named Hermaphroditus, and as a young man, he was a woman came up and saw him and fell in love with him and wrapped her arms around him so tightly that there were two bodies that became one, and then from then on he was hermaphrodite. The other theory is that that Hermaphroditus was born sort of intersex, ambiguously sexed at birth, and thus the parents decided to give him a name that reflected both the father and the mother. The concept of hermaphrodites was really taken as sort of an ideal, particularly in alchemic imagery, the idea of the perfect sort of union between male and female. And you see a lot of images like this, even of kings and queens that are half male, half female. And it shows the balance and the sort of ideal state that alchemists were trying to reach. Just a little aside about alchemy, a lot of people sort of think it's like an early chemistry that was trying to just turn lead into gold. But that was also just a metaphor for turning a leadened life into a golden or spiritual life. And that meant partially finding the right balance in your life. Unfortunately, actual intersex or hermaphrodite people in Western culture were not treated as well, as we know, particularly from probably the most famous diary of a French 19th century hermaphrodite named Herculine Barbin. And this was sort of quote-unquote discovered by Michel Foucault. And it's a story of a person who grew up as a woman who also had a penis and was a teacher in girls' school. And at one point she started to have pains, and what ended up happening was she had testes that dropped. And at that point, the medical community said, well, you're really a male. And she got sort of sent to the church and then to the courts, and was determined that no, she had to be a male from that point on, and became very depressed and despondent about having to change her life, and ended up committing suicide. A slightly older case, but much closer to home, is the story of Thomasine Hall, who lived in England and then went to Virginia. This is actually slightly wrong. Hall switched genders in England, but then when Paul came to Virginia, the Virginia colony, Paul came as a man. People started to have questions about Paul, though, because he could do traditionally female activities like make lakes. And so they eventually brought him to court, and after being examined both by men and women, the court concluded that Paul was both a man and a woman, and directed Paul to dress in elements of both men's and women's clothing. Now this, you might actually think is a pretty radical thing, really, because really what they did is they constructed a new gender for this person who was in their community. And that's pretty exciting in pre-colonial times. However, as Peter Lapson points out, the court created a new gender for Hall, but foreclosed the switching between male and female that had characterized Hall's earlier life. So, and we'll see this time and time again, but no matter sort of what social variant you're talking about, there's always going to be a desire to categorize and make it set, rather than allowing people to sort of shift fluidly between the spaces. There is some people who theorize that, in fact, George Washington, the father of our country, was also intersex, particularly that he might be have Klinefelter syndrome, which is often designated by rounder features, which is the face, the shoulders, chest, and hips, lesser no facial hair, and infertility. A more contemporary case is the case of Maria Pantino, who is a Spanish Olympic hurdler. She had won a number of events and then had to get a female test in which they scraped the inside of her cheek and tested to see if she had 2 X chromosomes. She failed that test and was denied entry into the 88 Olympics, was stripped of her past titles, and was barred from future competitions. And it took her a couple of years with both lawyers and doctors to sort of argue the case that she was indeed a female. What Maria Pantino had was what was called androgen insensitivity syndrome. So a genetic condition in which the cells of an XY body are unable to absorb androgens. So a body sort of develops as a male, as XY chromosomes, as testes that may not have descended, but those testes produce testosterone or other androgens, but the body can't accept it. So we know that if it doesn't accept those androgens, then it just keeps growing like a female. So these people look like females, but are genetically males. So the test in 88 was a double X. Okay, so we see a typical female has a double X, so they would have passed the test. Maria Pantino had an XY, so she didn't. But curiously, a person with Klinefelter, who might have a penis and other things, would have passed the test because they would have had 2 X chromosomes, and that's all that the test tested for. Now you might think this is totally rare and a bizarre case, but if we look 10 years later when the test got more sophisticated, or 8 years, in 1996, the Summer Olympic testing resulted in 8 females out of about 3,400 were intersex, and 7 of these had androgen insensitivity syndrome. Fortunately, all those 7, and I don't know about the 8th one, but all 7 were allowed to compete as females. Which brings us to what Robert Peel asked. Is Maria Pantino the woman she appears to be, or the man that tests say she is? She has been a female all her life, but does not have 2 X chromosomes. So what is she or he? I'm not going to try to answer that question here, but I do just want to leave you with a series of things to consider in the last section. What social and cultural norms influence the scientific discourse on sex? How many sexes are there? How many sexes should there be? Can there be a clear, fixed definition of each sex? If the definition of each sex is not fixed, what happens to our understanding of gender? If the definition of each sex is not fixed, what happens to our understanding of sexual orientation? Should intersex people be assigned a sex, and if so, how should it be determined? Should we correct bodies to fit our cultural norms, or vice versa? And I'll just leave you with a little story by Leslie Feinberg, who's a transgender activist. And she often says, she says she's waiting for the day when a couple will be going along with their baby, and someone will come up and say, "Oh, what a cute baby! What is it, a boy or a girl?" And they'll say, "I don't know. It hasn't told us yet." So that concludes the PowerPoint section, and I'm just going to read a brief section from my novel, And then I'll be glad to take any questions, so if you want to jot down things. I've chosen, for I don't know what reason, to read from a section that's pretty much later in the novel, so I have to sort of set it up a little bit. The novel is called Different Finland. It's set in 1988, and it's the story of what the medical community would define as a true hermaphrodite person named Jace. And Jace grows up in Ohio with Jace's mother, and nobody sort of knows about Jace's condition. She's decided not to have Jace surgically altered. But at 10, Jace has this bad bicycle accident, and when the local surgeon is sort of sewing up Jace's leg, the surgeon sort of discovers that Jace's body is not sort of a normal boy's body, and ends up convincing the mother and Jace to go to Johns Hopkins and consult Dr. Morley. And so they go there, Dr. Morley sort of talks to them and sort of takes pictures of Jace's body and sort of does this body exam, which for a 10-year-old really confuses and scares Jace. And we don't learn this till later, but when Jace comes back into the sort of main office, the mother sort of picks up on all this, that Jace is sort of scared, even though Jace doesn't say anything. And so she decides not to go ahead with any surgery. So Jace is writing this journal at 16 about Jace's life, and unfortunately, and nobody else in the community knows about this. And so, unfortunately, though, the journal, the book, the novel, gets discovered by some local boys in Jace's class. And so Jace figures that they have read it and will sort of tell everybody in the school about Jace. So Jace runs away and has a long adventure. Ends up, curiously, back in Columbus, Ohio, just a couple hours away. He's homeless, gets put in prison, but finally ends up working at a pencil factory, of all places, and lives with a couple of students who go to Ohio State University. So when Jace's life sort of settles down a bit, what ends up happening is Jace starts thinking more about, Jace sort of felt that Jace was the only person who was like them. I'll use them so to avoid the he or she pronoun. But decides to do some more research, and this is back in '88, so there weren't the internet readily available. So goes down to this huge university, to OSU, to look up information, and has gone down there once and gotten a list of a couple books, and is about to go back down again in this journal entry. See if I forgot anything else that you need to know. I think that's it. The last thing is just that the you that starts off this chapter and that's interspersed throughout the novel is the journal is written to Jace's future self. And Jace imagines that in the future, Jace is going to be in Finland, because Finland is the place where if you know Finnish, you don't commonly use he or she in pronouns in normal speech. So Jace sort of imagines Finland as a sort of ideal place where people are more accepting. So the you is the future of Jace. If it's you reading this and not someone else, then you know what I'm going to write. You know this story already, but I need to tell it anyway, for me. And if it's not you, stop reading. I don't want you here. I biked to OSU this morning. It's so huge. The streets are numbered, and they have buses just to get from one end of campus to the other. The day was warm, though, and the only thing in the sky was the full moon, and I was happy riding my new bike. The moon always makes me feel like something is watching me, keeping me safe. And the riding made me think of those days as a kid riding past the fields in Locust Grove. In some way, I realized those days I was more alive and free than I've ever been since. As I walked, I watched the other students and tried to move like they did, though I didn't have a backpack with me. It was past 11 by the time I got to the science library. I held the door open for a student and walked in behind her, holding the piece of paper with the call numbers in my hand. I was sure someone would stop me, and I had to keep telling myself, they don't know you don't belong here. They don't know you're not a student. The library smelled heavily of mildew and a vinyl scent from the new books and carpet. I walked down the metal shelves looking for the right section. Everything pressed close together, like I was walking through tight canyons, and I couldn't help but feel someone was watching me, though there was hardly anyone in the stacks. I wasn't expecting much from the titles I found last week on the computer. I thought that they would be too clinical to understand, but I had to go. I passed a few students in booths at the end of the stacks, too lost in study to notice me, even when I walked right past their desks. Each had piles of books and were filling spiral notebooks with tiny, neat handwriting. I could hear their pencils and pens scratching across the surface of the paper as I traced the first call number to the correct shelf. That's how quiet it was. The first book I found was about hermaphrodites in lower life forms. It was a chapter on sea animals. There was a chapter on sea animals and a subchapter on various mollusks. I read a few paragraphs, but the language was hard to follow. It had no pictures. All I figured out was that mollusks had two organs. I forget the names, one for sperm and one for eggs. Maybe I was like those creatures, but that hardly made me feel comforting. I put the book back on the shelf and searched for the next title. The second book was about genetic origins of sexual variations. Most scientists, it said, recognized that there were at least 5 different sexes. I wonder why no one had told me about this then. They listed the different chromosomal combinations, XX, XY, XXY, XXYY, and all except male and female were given special names like Turner syndrome or Klinefelter's disease, as though they were not just different but wrong. I wondered what made something a syndrome or a disease rather than normal or just unusual. If someone is super tall, like the giant at the Salamacus Museum, does that make them diseased? Most of the other sexes were pretty rare, but I wondered what it would be like if people were divided evenly into all the sexes. Nothing in the world would be the same. Bathrooms, marriage, love songs, clothes, jobs, movies, TV. Everything would change. There would be completely different rules. It would seem that anyone then would be able to love anyone else, except we'd probably find a way to make that not all right. I looked up from my place on the floor. No one was around except an Indian student in a cubicle at the far end of the aisle. He seemed a million miles away. All the same, I kept thinking someone was watching me, and I closed the book a moment to calm myself down. Someone walked past my aisle, and I put the book back and stood up. After walking downstairs and then back up, looking down all the rows to make sure no one was nearby, except the students in the cubicles, I searched for the third title, A Case History of Human Hermaphrodism, a large hardback with brownish-gray cloth. I sat on the floor between the tall, narrow stacks and opened the book slowly. The index listed about 50 medical histories starting from the late 1800s. Most of the cases had a few pictures of the person at the end, some with clothes, but most naked. I read in the introduction that they had changed the names of the patients to keep their privacy, but how private were their lives with pictures of them naked in books anyone could see? I began reading the oldest cases first. Most of the pictures were of adult, middle-aged, with their haircuts and styles of clothing so different. I felt at first that we didn't have much in common. But in most of those pictures, I could see something familiar in their eyes, that old wrinkled face with the sideburns, the big belly person with the dark, dark skin, and the long earrings. The person naked and then dressed in formal English clothes, the thin, pale teenager with bony shoulders and small breasts. I tried to imagine what each of them was thinking, how they felt about their own bodies. Some had become circus attractions, traveling around various countries as a freak of nature. Others had been put on trial or even killed for changing their sex, or pretending to be a sex the court decided they were not. Some who had seen a doctor or were brought to trial were forced to live as only one sex, and not always the one they wanted, but the one the courts or doctors thought their body best fit. The personal biographies were short, but I figured out a little more about each of their lives by reading the medical sections, where the doctors wrote about their problems the patients came to them for, whether they had had sex, and with whom, and if they acted as a man or woman, or both, or neither. After a couple hours, I got to the more recent cases, where the bodies in the photographs had their eyes covered with black rectangles, which made it hard to tell what the patients might be thinking. Still, I got some sense of who they were. Most of these people had been operated on and usually they had before and after pictures. Some said they were happy after surgery. Others, I remember the book stated, quote, had not adjusted well. A few had decided not to be operated on at all, even though the doctors had recommended it. I remember this one case. A pregnant woman went to a doctor for a checkup. This was in Burma. And when he saw her penis, he suggested that she have it removed, an operation. But when he couldn't come up with a good medical reason for doing it, she refused. Towards the end of the book, I read a case about a kid from Nebraska who was born the same year I was, but a month before me. The kid was brought up as a boy who they called Mark in an isolated part of the state and hadn't been able to get to a doctor until he was 9 years old. I felt my skin tingle. I couldn't believe it, that there was someone else with a story so close to mine. As I read about the first time Mark saw a doctor, I thought about the day Dr. Morley had told me how I had to make a choice about being a boy or a girl. I had wondered, once he'd left the room, if any other kid had gone through a similar thing. I had thought that I was all alone back then, but now I could picture Mark out there in the world as well, going through the same things I had gone through. I read each sentence slowly, feeling as though I had just found out I had a missing brother or sister. I wondered if Mark was still alive, and knew at the moment that if he was, I would have to find him. It would be hard, of course, because I didn't know his real name, or if he was still a boy, and the information in the book was almost 10 years old. The medical, section talked about the surgery that was recommended for Mark. I copied this paragraph on the back of a piece of paper I found in the study desk. Quote, Mark is content with being a boy socially. It is how he was brought up to be until now. It appears from x-rays that he has one testes that has not descended. Treatment calls for lower internal gonadal and adding prosthetic into a sutured vagina to form a scrotum. A radical hysterectomy should be performed concurrently. The operative procedures coupled with proper hormonal treatment should produce a normal male adult. The text was full of medical terms I didn't understand, but I read it all anyway. When I reached the end of the second page, I hesitated, knowing there would be pictures on the next page. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see Mark naked, defaced with a black rectangle over his eyes. A part of me wanted to respect him by not looking. If we ever met, I wanted to be able to tell him that. But another part of me was curious, and besides, how would I ever find him if I didn't know what he looked like? I turned the page. There were 3 black and white photos, each of a young kid standing against a white background. I recognized the pictures immediately, though I'd never seen them before. They were, of course, of me, my 10-year-old body, small and white, my eyes blacked out, my right leg with a scar that had recently been stitched. I looked at my little hands, stuck to the side, my small, tight mouth and a child nose, and just below the field of black that cut across my face. In the background, there was only the white, the curtain of Dr. Morley's office. I recognized myself, but without eyes, my body seemed like all the others, not quite human or alive. It was like looking at my own corpse. I dropped the book on the floor. I wanted to run out of the library and scream, but I couldn't move. I began to shake hard. The book had closed when it fell on the floor, and for the first time I looked closely at the names in the cover, 3 doctors' names, the last being Dr. James Morley. He had simply changed the names and details in her life. Thanks a lot.